He ordered coffee, never spoke, and left blood on the table. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Your presence makes every twist more intriguing. Now, the mystery unfolds. It was one of those long Parisian evenings in late October when the rain has no particular urgency and falls with a kind of weary rhythm, brushing against window panes without sound. The lamps along Boulevard Richard Lenoir gave off a pale yellow, light that shimmered in the puddles. Chief Inspector Maigret sat in his armchair beside the stove, pipe in hand, not smoking it. The bowl had gone out some time ago, and he hadn't relit it. Madame Maigret was finishing a row of knitting, her needles moving with the ease of long habit. The house was quiet except for the occasional scrape of a passing car on the wet street and the muffled chime of the clock on the mantel. "Would you like another tisane, Jules?" she asked gently, not looking up. He shook his head, exhaling softly. He didn't feel ill, nor tired. But there was something in the air, some vague sense of incompleteness, like when one finishes reading a novel and feels a curious dissatisfaction with the last page. They had eaten early, veal with carrots, and afterward he had read the paper, though he couldn't say what any of the headlines had been about. Politics, of course. Strikes, a small scandal in the 14th arrondissement. Somewhere someone had robbed a tobacconist. Nothing that called for him. It was, all things considered, a dull evening. "Lognon came by the office this morning," Maigret murmured finally, not to begin a conversation so much as to let the silence settle differently. Madame Maigret raised her eyes. "Oh?" Looking gloomy as ever. "He's caught some nonsense case. A man found dead in a rented room near Garret." "Do not. Nothing stolen. No violence. Heart attack, most likely." She gave a faint approving sound and returned to her needles. "It's not our concern," he added. He stood slowly, stretching his legs. The pipe went into his coat pocket without another attempt at lighting it. He wasn't sure why he took his coat, only that the apartment had grown a little too warm. Or perhaps it was his mood. "Just getting some air," he said. She nodded, without surprise. He often took such walks. Not far, usually ending up at a small café or under an awning watching the street. Maigret was not a man driven by routine but by mood, and tonight his mood was undefined, foggy. The rain had stopped by the time he reached the corner, though the scent of it clung to everything: stone, wood, leaves, the wool of his collar. He didn't walk toward the quay nor toward the office. His feet took him south, to a quieter part of the 11th, where small cafés stayed open later than they ought to, and no one asked why a man sat alone for an hour without ordering a second drink. It was at Le Petit Baigneur, a modest place near Rue Trousseau, that he stopped. The place was narrow and old, wood-panelled, with a zinc bar and lace curtains yellowed from years of smoke. Inside were 3 tables occupied, a couple playing cards in silence, a middle-aged man reading François, and at the back, half-shadowed by the partition near the toilets, a solitary figure. Maigret took his usual place at the front, near the door where he could watch without being watched. "Bonsoir, patron," he said to the man behind the counter. "Inspector," the man replied with a nod. "Your usual." Maigret nodded, removing his coat and laying it beside him. The warmth was pleasant here, a damp, lived-in warmth, heavy with the smell of wine, cheese, and wet wool. As he waited for his drink, he glanced around with idle interest. The man reading the paper hadn't turned a page in several minutes. The couple weren't really playing anymore. The woman stared out the window as if trying to remember something long lost. But it was the man at the back table who unsettled him, not by any action or peculiarity, but because he didn't seem to belong. There was nothing obvious. He wore a respectable overcoat, if a bit too new, a hat beside him too carefully brushed. He drank from a small glass of fin aloe, and his hands were folded on the table, but he wasn't relaxed. Maigret watched him without watching, the way a cat might regard a rustle in the grass. The man's gaze wandered often, to the window, to the mirror behind the bar, to the clock. Not nervously, not rapidly, just deliberately. He reminded Maigret of a traveller in a strange town pretending to be a local. The patron brought Maigret his glass of beer with a small bowl of hard cheese cubes. "Quiet tonight," Maigret said casually. "Always on Thursdays," the patron replied. "Who's the man in the back?" The barman hesitated just enough to be noticed. "Don't know him. Came in about an hour ago, didn't say much, asked if it was all right to sit there." Maigret nodded and took a sip. The beer was just cool enough, with that faint metallic tang from the tap. Something itched at him. Not suspicion, not yet. Just a sense that this man, this stranger, had not come to Le Petit Baigneur by chance. Or if he had, he was waiting for something, or someone. He stayed another 30 minutes, long enough to light his pipe properly, long enough to notice the man hadn't looked at him once, though surely he knew he was being watched. At 9:45, the stranger stood, put on his coat and hat, paid in coins, and left without a word. Maigret remained seated. He didn't follow, but he didn't forget. Not because anything had happened, but because something hadn't, and sometimes that was more important. He stayed 10 more minutes, letting the weight of silence soak in. Then he rose, paid, and stepped back into the chill of the street. The drizzle had returned. Paris glistened quietly. He turned his collar up and walked home slowly, as if waiting for something to catch up to him. The next morning was grey again, as if the city hadn't turned the page. Boulevard Richelieu was slick with rain from the night before, and a fine mist hovered just above the pavement. Chief Inspector Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres just before 8, his coat damp and shoulders slightly hunched from the walk along the Seine. The building smelled as always, floor polish, old paper, and the faint aroma of coffee from the canteen downstairs. He hung up his coat, placed his bowler hat on the rack, and nodded to Janvier, who was already flipping through a stack of incident reports. "Anything interesting?" Maigret asked without expectation. Janvier shrugged, the usual. One drunk was found unconscious behind a kiosk on Rue des Petites Écuries, a petty theft near Belleville. Woman claims someone took her handbag and dog. The dog turned up, though, 2 streets away. "Good for the dog," Maigret muttered, lighting his pipe. He took the stack of papers anyway and leafed through them at his desk, slowly, more to occupy his hands than out of curiosity. One report, and very briefly, mentioned a man who had come into the Gare de Lyon the previous evening, without luggage, no ID, and no ticket. He had refused to give his name, and simply walked out of the station before he could be questioned. The gendarme on duty had scribbled a note, but no further action had been taken. Maigret stared at the report for a moment longer than necessary, then folded it and tucked it into his inner pocket. Lognon appeared just before 10, looking as though he had been rained on twice and then ironed by hand. His overcoat was slightly too big, and the belt flapped at his sides like loose reins. He always looked like a man who had arrived too late, even when he was early. "Morning, Inspector," he said glumly. Maigret gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Are you still chasing that dead man from yesterday?" "Officially, no," Lognon said, rubbing his hands. "Cause of death came back as natural. Myocardial infarction. 61 years old. Rented a room by the station, had no visitors, and paid cash. The landlord said he was polite, and unofficially." Lognon hesitated, glanced toward the open office door, then leaned in slightly. "Doesn't feel right," he admitted. He had nothing on him. No ID, no wallet, not even a handkerchief. Just a little leather case with a pencil stub and 3 francs. No return address on the case? Nothing, not even initials. Maigret tapped his pipe against the edge of his ashtray and said nothing. There were many men in Paris who came to die quietly. Some had their reasons. He didn't press Lognon, nor did he offer to take over. It wasn't a case, not yet. Around 11, Maigret left the office and walked. The air had begun to clear, and the light was soft, the kind that made building facades look older, gentler. He didn't have a destination in mind, or rather he did, but he wouldn't admit it to himself. Le Petit Baigneur was as quiet in daylight as it had been the night before. The door still creaked slightly when pushed, and the lace curtains filtered the light into dusty shapes on the floor. The patron looked up from behind the bar, surprised. "Back already, Inspector?" Maigret nodded. "Any coffee?" "Of course." He sat in the same place and accepted the chipped ceramic cup. It was strong, overboiled, but hot. The couple from last night were gone. Only an older man in a railway uniform sat by the wall, reading the sports page. Maigret turned slightly, to glance at the back table. Empty. He didn't stay long. When he left, he looked up and down the street, then crossed to the opposite side and waited beneath a yellow awning. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps a man with a brushed hat and a coat that didn't match the way he moved. The rest of the day passed slowly. Files were read, calls were made, and by late afternoon, Maigret had almost forgotten the stranger. Or tried to. He left the office at a little past 6 and walked again, slower this time, letting the rhythm of his steps set his thoughts in order. When he reached the corner of Rue Trousseau, it was just growing dark. Lights flickered on behind closed windows. A cat darted beneath a parked van. The rain, which had hesitated all day, returned in a thin drizzle. He entered the café and removed his coat. This time the stranger was already there. Same table, same seat, same drink, the faint smell of anise in the air from the fine aloe. He was reading something, or pretending to. A book, open and resting on the table, but the man's eyes were elsewhere. Watching the mirror, watching the room. Maigret didn't go to his usual seat. He walked slowly to the bar, ordered a beer, and leaned against the counter, facing the man from a distance. The patron poured without speaking. "You know he was here again this morning," the barman whispered. "Sat for nearly an hour. No drink. Just waited." "For whom?" The man shook his head. Didn't say, didn't speak at all. Maigret sipped his beer. The stranger turned a page. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The door opened once. A young man looking for someone else, who apologized and left. At last Maigret moved. He approached the table with the slow, unhurried weight of someone who had all the time in the world. "Evening," he said, not asking for permission. The man looked up. His face was neutral, calm. He was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and pale, watchful eyes. His lips barely moved when he replied, "Bonsoir." Maigret gestured to the chair opposite. "May I?" A pause, then a nod. He sat. The stranger closed his book, but left it on the table. Maigret didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply lit his pipe, struck the match twice before it caught, and exhaled as the smoke curled toward the ceiling. Silence is a strange thing. It can be heavy or light. In that moment, it was something in between, waiting to become something else. "I've seen you before," Maigret said eventually softly. "Not from here, are you?" "No." "Looking for someone?" The man didn't answer. The silence returned. After a moment, The stranger stood, slowly, politely. He left 2 coins on the table and tucked the book under his arm. "Good night," he said. Maigret watched him leave. He didn't follow. Instead, he leaned back, finishing what remained of his beer, and looked at the damp impression the man had left on the wooden chair. It was shaped like anyone else's, but the air he left behind, that lingered. Maigret lit his pipe again, and waited. The next morning, Maigret did not go directly to the office. He woke a little earlier than usual, feeling the tug of that unresolved presence, the man at the back table, like the aftertaste of strong coffee. As he shaved, he caught himself staring not into the mirror, but through it. A face with no history had stared back at him the night before, polite, composed, and carefully void of anything memorable. And yet, Maigret remembered him. "Will you be back for lunch?" Madame Maigret asked, pouring his coffee as he adjusted the knot of his scarf. He hesitated. "Perhaps not. Don't wait." She gave a small nod and set the jar of plum jam on the table with a soft clink. There was nothing more to say. She had seen this mood before, the one where something unnamed had lodged itself in her husband's mind and would not be dislodged by routine or reasoning. It was just past 8 when he stepped out. The morning mist had settled along the curbs and garden hedges like a soft breath, and the pavements glistened underfoot. Paris looked subdued, its noises still hushed, the day not fully awake. Maigret didn't head toward Quai des Orfèvres. Instead, he took a tram south and got off near Rue Abel, a quiet stretch not far from the Gare de Lyon. He stood across the street from a narrow 4-story building of faded brick and shuttered windows. The address listed on the incident report from the previous day, the one Lognon had mentioned. The rooming house where the man with no papers had died. He didn't ring the bell right away. He waited across the street, watching. A postman came and went. A young woman emerged with a child clutching her hand. The city's engine was beginning to turn slowly without urgency. At last he crossed and rang the bell. A faint buzz followed and the door clicked open. Inside, the air was a mixture of boiled potatoes, damp coats, and furniture polish. The hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling near the corners, the kind of place where time accumulated without effort. A woman in her 50s stood at the base of the stairs, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. Her expression was guarded. "Bonjour, madame," Maigret said, showing his card. "Chief Inspector Maigret." Her eyes widened slightly. "I already spoke to the other one, the thin one with the cough." "Inspector Lognon, yes, I'm following up. May I come in?" She stepped aside. "It's about the man in number 4, isn't it?" He nodded. They climbed 2 flights. The boards creaked beneath their feet. On the landing she stopped and pointed at a door at the end of the corridor. The brass number had dulled with age. He was quiet, neat. Paid in advance, 3 days. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't speak much either. "Did he say his name?" She shook her head. "He signed the ledger as Lucien Morel, but I'm not sure that was real. Could be made up. He had no ID." Maigret nodded. "Did anyone visit him?" "No. He only went out once the second evening and came back just before 10. Didn't say where he'd been." Maigret stared at the door a moment. "May I?" She handed him a key from her apron pocket. He opened the door slowly. The room was plain. Iron bed, washstand, small desk, and a wardrobe that had seen better decades. The air still held the faint scent of soap and dust. The bed was neatly made. Nothing about the space suggested a life, only a brief stopover. He moved slowly, inspecting the desk. 1 pencil, a few pages of blank stationery, and a small envelope with nothing inside. He opened the wardrobe. 2 shirts, both clean. No personal photographs, no notes, no books. Just silence. "Where is his suitcase?" He asked. There wasn't one, she said, surprised. He arrived with a folded coat over his arm and that small leather case, that's all. And the case? With the police, I think. He closed the wardrobe and turned to the window. It faced a courtyard, empty save for a few bins and a rusting bicycle. Back downstairs he asked to see the ledger. It was a thick, cloth-bound book with yellowed pages. He found the entry. Lucien Morel, room 4, arrived on the 26th. No home address, no identification number, just the name in precise cursive and a signature that looked almost too careful. As he stepped outside, Maigret paused on the threshold, lighting his pipe. He smoked slowly, watching the street, letting the details settle. A man arrives in Paris with no luggage, no friends, no past, checks into a room, dies quietly. And 2 nights later, a man who matches his vague description in age, posture, demeanor, sits at a café in another arrondissement, pretending not to look in a mirror. Coincidence, maybe, but Maigret didn't believe in those. He took the tram back into the center and arrived at Quai des Orfèvres just after 10. Janvier was at his desk, bent over a report. Any word from the lab on that case Lognon brought? Janvier frowned. Yes, came in half an hour ago. Nothing. No traces of medication, no poison, nothing odd in the stomach. Just heart failure. Clean. And the contents of the leather case. Lognon logged it. Do you want to see it? Maigret nodded. In the property room the leather case was retrieved. It was worn but intact, brown with age, a small brass clasp. Inside, as described, a stub of pencil, 3 francs in coins, and nothing else. Maigret ran his finger along the interior lining. No hidden compartments, no notes, no monogram. Could have belonged to anyone, he murmured, but it hadn't. He returned to his office and sat for a while, smoking quietly. He stared at the file before him. Then he wrote on a small slip of paper. Lucien Morel, possible alias, Rue Abel boarding house. Deceased, 26th October. No ID, no luggage, leather case. He placed the slip in a folder marked Pending and set it to one side. In the late afternoon he returned to Le Petit Baigneur. The rain had returned, not a downpour, just the kind that tapped politely at hat brims and soaked the hems of trousers. The windows of the café glowed faintly from inside, and the smell of wet pavement mixed with the scent of wine and stale tobacco as he entered. The stranger was not there. Maigret sat, ordered his beer, watched the back table. Nothing stirred. But at precisely 7:15, the door opened. The same man entered, same coat, same book, same neutral gaze. He took his seat in the back without hesitation and placed his drink order with a nod. Maigret waited 5 minutes, then approached. "Bonsoir," he said. The man looked up. "Bonsoir." "No one's looking for you," Maigret said quietly, more an observation than a threat. "But you're acting like someone who expects to be found." The stranger didn't answer. He looked at Maigret steadily, then down at his drink. "I'm not here to arrest you," Maigret added. "I just don't like loose ends." The stranger lifted his glass and took a slow sip. "I was never here," he said. Then he stood and left again, leaving behind a warm glass, a dry chair, and a name that hadn't been spoken. The next day Maigret returned to his desk at Quai des Orfèvres with an odd feeling of unfinished conversation. The stranger's final words, "I was never here," echoed less as denial and more as a quiet plea, the sort of thing said not to deceive, but to preserve some fragile illusion. And yet Maigret felt no closer to knowing who the man was, or what he was waiting for. The morning passed uneventfully. Reports piled in from the arrondissement, each stamped, initialed, and added to their corresponding stacks. Burglaries, domestic arguments, a failed suicide attempt near Montparnasse. Routine, squalid, small human dramas. But none of them bore the faint scent of unease that still clung to Maigret's thoughts. At 11, Madame Maigret telephoned, something she did rarely unless there was a real reason. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "Jules," she said, "you received a letter, hand-delivered this morning. There's no return address. The handwriting is unfamiliar. Anyone see who brought it?" "No, it was already inside the mailbox when I checked, but it was sealed. Pale blue envelope. Smelled faintly of cologne." He was silent for a moment. "Would you bring it to the office? I'm on my way to the market. I'll pass by." She arrived half an hour later carrying a paper bag of apples in one hand and the letter in the other. She set both on his desk and gave him a brief, knowing look before excusing herself. The envelope was, as she'd said, pale blue, slightly thick. The address was written with a fine hand, as though each letter had been rehearsed. He opened it carefully and unfolded the single page within. The note was short. Inspector Maigret. "There are things better left where they fell, but if you insist on watching shadows, you'll find none at noon. No one will come again. No one ever meant to. L.M. There was no signature, no date and no formal greeting. Yet the initials L.M.K. struck Maigret not as coincidence but as an echo. Lucien Morel. The false name from the boarding-house ledger. He stared at the note, turning it over. No watermark. The handwriting had a slight tremor in it, as if the person writing it had paused often, not from hesitation, but from old habit. He placed the letter in an envelope of his own and tucked it into the pending folder, beside the slip he had written the day before. Janvier entered just then, clutching a police bulletin from the archives. "I ran a trace on the name Lucien Morel," he said. "Dozens of hits. Most are petty clerks, retirees, or fictional registrations. But there's one odd match, from 1937, a shipping manifest. Man disembarked in Le Havre from Casablanca. No residence listed. Passport stamped temporary travel, and then nothing. Nothing. No record since." Maigret leaned back in his chair. Casablanca. A long way from Paris, but in 1937 it would have been even farther. A place people went to disappear or to wait. The late 30s had been full of such men, those whose names did not outlast the war. "Can we get the manifest?" "I've requested a copy," Janvier said, "but it might take a day or two. Records that are old are still on microfilm." Maigret nodded. "Let me know when it arrives." For the rest of the afternoon, he did little more than wait. The stranger did not return to Le Petit Baigneur that evening, nor the next, nor the one after that. But Maigret went, each time, ordering his beer, sitting at the same table, watching the back of the café. He came early and left late, not because he expected anything to happen, but because something had already begun, and he didn't want to miss its quiet conclusion. It was on the fourth night that a different presence entered the café, an older woman, narrow shoulders beneath a black coat too formal for the hour, with a scarf tied under her chin in the provincial style. She hesitated just inside the door, peering toward the rear tables. Her gaze moved past Maigret without recognition. Then she approached the bar. The patron greeted her quietly, politely. "Are you looking for someone, madame?" Maigret asked, standing slowly from his seat. She turned, startled by the gentleness of the voice more than its presence. "I was told I might find someone here." "Who told you?" She looked away. "A friend. From the old days." Maigret gestured toward a nearby chair. "Please." They sat, and he ordered her a small wine. She held the glass in both hands, as if for warmth. "I don't know his real name," she said after a while. I knew him once as Michel Lestrade. That was a long time ago. Where? Oran, 1938. He was working for a shipping concern. I worked in the port office. We were both displaced, I suppose. Maigret said nothing. He had long learned that the best way to hear a story was not to ask for it. He disappeared one day, just gone. No letter, no goodbye. I thought maybe he'd gone back to the mainland. And now? She looked around the café, her eyes lingering on the empty back table. A few weeks ago I received a note. No name, no return address, just a line. Le Petit Baigneur. Evenings. October. Maigret felt the chill rise in his spine. The cahier. Same handwriting, he imagined. The same fragrance faint on the paper. Why do you think he contacted you? She smiled faintly, the way people do when remembering something both beautiful and painful. I think he wanted to be seen. Just once more, not forgiven, not reclaimed, just witnessed. Maigret nodded slowly. That he understood. Do you know if he's still in Paris? I don't know anything, she said. Only that I came. They sat in silence. The wine between them grew cold. Outside, the rain began again, more insistent this time. When she stood to leave, Maigret didn't stop her. He simply watched as she walked into the night, coat drawn close, vanishing into the curtain of rain. The stranger did not return that night either, nor the one after. But Maigret now knew something that had not existed before. The man had a past, a borrowed name, a broken connection, and perhaps a reason for having returned. Not to be caught, not to confess, but to allow someone else to remember. The file stayed open on his desk, but he did not press. Some truths came like the weather, not in storms, but in slow-moving clouds that never broke, yet never quite left. The rain continued into the morning, soft but constant, like a metronome beating a slow, steady rhythm over Paris. In the offices of the police judiciaire, the windows were filmed with condensation, and the radiators ticked quietly as they warmed. The rooms with tired heat. Maigret sat at his desk with a fresh pot of coffee and his pipe, which he had filled but not lit. Across from him, Janvier hovered with a manila folder. The file from Le Havre, Janvier said. Shipping manifest from 1937. I had them pull the passenger cards too, just in case. Maigret reached for the folder. The cardboard was still damp from transit, the edges slightly curled. Inside, a series of photocopies, grainy scans from yellowed paper. A manifest for the ship La Ville de Tunis. Among the names, Lestrade, Michel. Age 32, port of origin Casablanca. Profession listed as freight clerk. Nationality, French. No further address. No forwarding contact. Doesn't tell us much, Janvier said with a shrug. It tells us enough, Maigret replied softly. He existed. Janvier studied his superior for a moment, then returned to his desk. Maigret sat alone, slowly turning the pages. The other names on the manifest blurred into anonymity. Emigrants, sailors, wives returning home. But the name Lestrade, Michel, now carried the weight of memory, or at least of longing. He wondered if that woman from the café had ever known his real name. Later that morning, Maigret took the blue envelope, the one with the cryptic message, and walked to the archives in the basement, where old correspondences were kept in folders tagged by date and type. He asked for the handwriting specialist. Gerard was a lean man in shirt sleeves, with ink stains on his fingers, and a voice that never rose above a whisper. "You want handwriting analysis?" he asked, blinking. "Only a comparison." "This envelope and note. I want to know if the same person also wrote this." Maigret handed him a second slip, the hotel ledger page from the Rue Abel boarding house, signed Lucien Morel. Girard adjusted his glasses and set to work, He made no promises. Handwriting, he often said, was a trace of the nervous system. Change the mood, the purpose, the pen, and a man's hand could shift completely, but still the strokes bore hints of their maker. "Come back after lunch," Girard murmured. Maigret nodded and left, the blue envelope now feeling heavier in his coat pocket. Around midday, Maigret stepped out. He walked without urgency, avoiding the usual haunts. He passed by the Quai des Célestins, pausing to watch the water where it curved lazily beneath the Pont Marie. Barges moved slowly, the wake barely disturbing the surface. It was a view he often returned to, not for beauty, but for its sense of permanence. The Seine had seen many comings and goings. It did not hurry. He found himself inevitably at a tabac just off Rue Saint-Antoine, a quiet place where the owner knew him but never asked questions. He sat near the stove and ordered a small calvados. A group of young men played cards at the back, their laughter subdued. On the radio, a voice read the noon news: budget talks, a fire in Marseille, the discovery of an old skeleton in a village well. No mention of nameless men in boarding houses. When he returned to the archives, Girard was waiting. "The letter and the ledger," he said. "The same hand. Not identical, but consistent. Same slant, same hesitation on the lowercase t's. Whoever wrote one wrote the other, or was trying very hard to imitate himself." Maigret nodded. He had expected as much. "No idea who he is?" Girard asked. "I have an idea," Maigret said, "but no proof. And I don't think he wants to be found." Girard gave a sympathetic shrug. Some ghosts like it that way. By the time Maigret returned upstairs, the light had shifted. Outside the windows, the rain had become mist, and people were beginning to emerge again, umbrellas tucked under arms. The city was resuming its pace. Maigret reread the letter once more at his desk. "There are things better left where they fell. No one will come again. No one ever meant to." A man's way of saying farewell without admitting it. Still, there was something unfinished, a detail Maigret couldn't place. He found himself thinking again of the woman, the one who had come to Le Petit Baigneur and spoken so softly of Oran and 1938. What was her name? She had never said that. She had simply been someone from before, and now she too has vanished. That evening Maigret returned to the café. The chair at the back remained empty. The patron greeted him as usual, but with a touch of curiosity. "He's not been back," he said, unasked. "Neither has the woman." "I expected as much," Maigret replied. He took his usual seat and ordered a beer. The foam settled slowly in the glass, like the final chapter of a story that refused to end. He stayed longer than usual, this time not watching the door. He let the café unfold around him, the low hum of conversation, the shuffle of cards, the scratch of a chair leg against tile. These were the city's real sounds. The stranger, for all his mystery, had become just another shadow that had passed through them. At 9:10, he rose to leave. As he reached for his coat, the patron called out quietly, "There was another letter." Maigret turned. "Came this morning," the man said, fishing it from under the bar. "Same handwriting, I think. No stamp." Maigret took it. The envelope was grey this time and slightly thicker. He opened it at the table. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, creased in the corners. It showed a group of 6 people standing near a dock. Ships in the background. 3 men, 3 women. One of the men wore a hat, slightly tilted. His face was younger, fuller, but unmistakable. The man from the café. On the back, a single word, Oran. No date, no names, just the place. Maigret stared at it a long time. The sea behind them, the sun catching their shoulders. A moment captured, not for proof but for memory. He slid the photograph into his coat pocket and left the café. stepping once more into the Paris night. The rain had stopped. The air was cool and smelled faintly of chestnuts from a vendor's cart at the corner. As he walked back toward the boulevard, the image stayed with him, 6 people, smiling without knowing why the moment mattered. A man who had once been Michel Lestrade, and who now asked to be no one. Some cases never reached court, some never had a crime. But still, Maigret kept them, not in his files, but in his mind. Shelved like unfinished books, waiting only for their final paragraph to write itself, or vanish. The photograph had not left Maigret's pocket since he received it. He had unfolded it at his desk the next morning, just as dawn was brushing the rooftops beyond Quai des Orfèvres, and set it under the glow of his lamp. The edges were worn from years of being handled, maybe kept in a wallet or drawer. There were 6 people in the frame, their postures casual but clearly aware of the camera. 2 women leaning toward each other, a man with a pipe at the edge, another half-crouched, smiling. In the center stood the man Maigret knew from Le Petit, Peigneur. He wore a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up. His hair was longer then, thick and wind-blown, but the eyes were unmistakable, guarded, almost amused. The word Oran scrawled on the back gave the photo its weight. Maigret had never been to Oran, but he knew its reputation, a place of exiles, of temporary lives. Especially in the years before the war, it had drawn the displaced, the unwanted, and the watchful. Ships arrived and left with no fanfare. Identities shifted like sand. He lit his pipe and stared at the group. Who were they now, still alive? Had any of them returned to Paris under other names, other faces? Perhaps this was the only trace left of them, this photo faded by time and salt air. It was Janvier who interrupted his thoughts. "There's a woman outside," he said, "asking for you, won't give her name." Maigret stood without a word and stepped into the corridor. A figure waited near the window, the same woman from the café, the one who had asked for Michel. Today she wore a different coat, grey wool buttoned high at the neck. Her eyes, when she turned to him, were unreadable. "You received it?" she asked. "I did." They stood in silence for a moment. The hallway buzzed faintly from the overhead lights, and somewhere a typewriter clicked with steady rhythm. "Why send it now?" he asked at last. "I didn't send it." Her voice was low. She stepped toward the window, looking out at the street below, where buses moved slowly along the embankment. "I hadn't seen that photograph in nearly 20 years. Then, 3 days ago, it arrived by post. No letter, just a photo." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a smaller envelope, cream-colored, bearing no stamp. Inside, folded, into fourths, was a note in the same careful script Maigret had come to recognize. "Time wears things down, but not completely. I thought you should have it. After all, it was your smile that day." No signature, no date. Maigret took it gently, then gestured for her to sit in his office. She did so reluctantly, settling in the stiff wooden chair opposite his desk. For a few moments neither spoke. He did not interrogate her. He merely waited, and after a long silence, she spoke. "He wasn't always like that. Michel, I mean. He was warm once, clever, made people laugh. We were all living in borrowed time in Oran, but we all knew it. But he had a way of pretending it could last. That life could be ordinary." Maigret said nothing. "We shared a flat, just one room. We cooked on a spirit stove. We had 2 chairs, no radio, and we were happy in our strange, quiet way. Until he left." "Why did he leave?" She looked up, eyes sharpening for the first time. "Because he was scared of what might come, of what he'd already done. I never knew all of it. Only that one night he didn't come back. And now. I think he wanted to be remembered." Maigret leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand but unlit. He thought of the man in the café, always watching the mirror, never staying long. The name in the hotel ledger, the letter without a return address, and now this, a woman bearing a memory, carefully folded, like a fragile keepsake. "Do. You believe he's still in Paris?" She nodded. "He would never send that photo unless he meant me to find him. But he won't come to me. That's not who he is anymore." "Then who is he?" Her lips pressed together in something almost like pity. A man waiting for silence to catch up to him. Maigret looked at the photo again. The group of 6. The smiles, the sunlight, the illusion of permanence. Then he stood and reached for his coat. "Come with me," he said. They walked together through the corridors, down the stone steps, into the soft afternoon outside. The sky had brightened slightly, though a chill still clung to the air. No one spoke on the walk. They turned down Rue de Harlay, then crossed to the bridge and continued along the quiet streets beyond. At Le Petit Baigneur Maigret opened the door first, holding it for her as they entered. The interior was unchanged, the same musty warmth, the same dull glow from the frosted windows. A couple sat at the far wall sharing a newspaper. The back table was empty. They took a seat near the front. "He won't come if I'm here," she said quietly, watching the door. "Perhaps not," Maigret replied. "But perhaps he already has." She turned to him with a puzzled look. "He might have come yesterday or the day before, sat here, watched, waited, and left again. Just knowing you were near might have been enough." She looked back at the door, her expression unreadable. A man passed outside, his coat flapping in the breeze. Then silence returned. Maigret ordered a coffee for her, a beer for himself. They drank slowly. The clock on the wall ticked in steady rhythm. "Tell me," Maigret said gently, "did he ever speak of a man named Morel?" She nodded. "Yes, but that wasn't a name. It was a joke between us, a made-up identity, something he'd use when checking into places anonymously. Said it made him feel safer, less traceable." "And Lestrade?" She hesitated. "That was real, his mother's name. He took it back when he left Oran, said his father's name no longer protected him." Maigret sat with this quietly. It was not evidence. It was something better, understanding. As the hour grew late and the café began to thin, Maigret stood. He left enough coins to cover both drinks and turned to her. "If he writes again," he said, "tell him I'm not looking for an arrest, only an answer." She smiled faintly. "I'll try." They stepped into the street together, where the wind had picked up. She turned left toward the metro. Maigret stood a while, watching the empty corner, then turned back the way he came. The photograph still pressed against his chest, in his inner pocket, warming slightly with his steps. The weather turned again that night. Paris was struck by a cold front that arrived quietly but decisively, and by morning the streets wore a sheen of frost. The breath of passers-by bloomed in pale clouds. At Quai des Orfèvres, the radiators clanged and groaned, unsure of whether to wake fully or continue dozing in the old pipes. Maigret arrived just before 8. His scarf was thick at his throat, his coat still damp from the morning drizzle. He paused at the brass rail in the entryway to knock the moisture from his shoes, and stood a moment at the base of the stairwell, watching a clerk carry a stack of case files with the careful focus of someone who had learned to balance bureaucracy, like glass. He made his way to his office, placed his hat on the hook and set the photograph, now housed in a paper sleeve, gently on his desk. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the file from the Rue Abel boarding house. There was something about it he hadn't finished with, a detail that had scratched faintly at the back of his mind. He turned to the page with the ledger again. The name, Lucien Morel. The signature, neat and cautious. But it wasn't just the name, it was the date. The date of arrival, 26th of October. Maigret's eyes narrowed. He pulled the photograph from its sleeve, flipped it over. Nothing written. There but Oran, no year, no date. Still, the paper itself told a story, old but not ancient, and the ink on the reverse, slightly faded, suggested it hadn't been written decades ago. He reached for the telephone. Get me the boarding house on Rue Abel and the landlady, if possible. He waited, fingers drumming on the desk, watching the pipe smoke spiral into the ceiling like a lazy thread. Yes? A voice answered. Madame Fournier. This is Chief Inspector Maigret. A pause. Yes, I remember. Tell me, has anyone else asked about the man in room 4 since I last visited? Not since the other inspector. The quiet one. Lognon? Yes, he was here again yesterday. Maigret frowned. Did he say why? Said he was checking final paperwork. Nothing else. Signed the register again. May I ask, does your ledger go back? More than a year. I suppose there are 3 books. I've kept them, even the old ones. Would it be possible to look through them? She hesitated. Of course, though I'm not sure you'll find much. I'll be there within the hour. Maigret hung up and stood, reaching for his coat again. Before leaving, he placed the photograph back in the sleeve and slid it into his inside pocket. The pipe went cold on the desk, forgotten. The journey to Rue Abel was uneventful. The tram was only half full, mostly office workers and a few school children bundled in scarves. The grey light made the buildings along the route appear colourless, as if the whole quarter had been drained of warmth overnight. Madame Fournier greeted him at the door with her usual cautious reserve. She led him to a side room, where a small desk stood near the window, covered in piles of threadbare linen and folded pillowcases. From the drawer beneath, she withdrew 2 worn ledger books and handed them over with a slight grimace, as though reluctant to disturb their dusty order. He leafed through the first. Pages filled with names, dates, destinations. One stood out. L. Morel, Room 3, 14th January. Then again 2 pages later. Morel L., Room 1, 3 April. He turned to her. This man, Morel, do you remember him ever staying more than once? She blinked. I thought he looked familiar. When he came in October I had a feeling, but it's hard to say. People come and go. Maigret laid the open ledger side by side with the latest one. He examined the signatures. Identical. Same slant, same loops. The same careful hand trying not to seem too careful. Would you say he used the same name each time? As far as I recall, yes, but he looked different in October. Older, more tired. Not someone you'd remember at first glance. Maigret flipped to the last recorded stay, 3rd April. There was a note in the margin, faint pencil. Left early. No refund. Do you remember why he left early? She frowned. No. Perhaps he was spooked. Or changed his mind. Or perhaps, Maigret thought, he saw someone. Someone he hadn't expected to see. He returned the books and thanked her. Back at the office, the puzzle grew murkier. Janvier poked his head in as Maigret was hanging up his coat. You have a visitor, he said. Someone from the Foreign Affairs Registry. Says you asked for records on a Lestrade, Michel. Yes, send him in. A thin man with wire spectacles entered, carrying a slim file. We've got a bit of a trail, he said. Not much. Fragmentary. This Lestrade may have worked briefly for the customs office in Algiers, sometime in 1939. But then he disappears. The record shows a suspected departure under the name Lambert, bound for Marseille. After that, nothing. No trace since? The man shook his head. Some people fell through the cracks in those years. Many didn't want to be found. Maigret nodded and dismissed him. He closed the file and lit his pipe again, the tobacco catching this time. The room filled with its quiet, sweet aroma. Lestrade, Lambert, Morel, all the same man. And if so, what was he doing in Paris now? Not hiding. Not exactly. Not running either. Waiting. But for what? The next evening, Maigret returned again. To Le Petit Baigneur. It had become a habit. One part duty, one part something harder to define. The chair at the back table remained empty. The patron gave a small shake of the head as Maigret entered, already reaching for the inspector's usual glass. But something new waited for him. A folded napkin set under the ashtray at the back table. Maigret walked to it slowly, as if approaching an altar. He unfolded it. Inside, a note, just 5 words, handwritten in the now familiar script. I remember what I did. No date, no name, no location. Maigret folded it again, slid it into his coat pocket, and returned to his beer. The truth, it seemed, was drawing nearer, not with answers, but with quiet footsteps. The following morning arrived beneath a low, heavy sky, the kind that made the rooftops blur into the horizon and turned the Seine into a ribbon of dull lead. It was the kind of morning Maigret disliked, not for the cold or the greyness, but because it seemed to offer nothing. No answers, no decisions, only the soft persistence of time passing with no event. He arrived at the office just after 8. The building was quiet. A few constables smoked near the entrance. The usual stack of fresh incident reports waited, unread on his desk. But Maigret didn't sit. He remained by the window, watching the vapor from his breath tap against the cold glass. Inside his coat pocket was the note from the café. I remember what I did. He hadn't told Janvier or Lognon about it. He hadn't logged it. He wasn't even sure why he had kept it. There was no name, no signature, no date. And yet, Maigret was certain that it had not been left for the police. It had been left for him. He lit his pipe, letting the first drawer settle deep in his chest. He returned to the Rue Abel boarding house just before 10. Madame Fournier seemed surprised to see him again, but said nothing, only ushered him in and gestured toward her small parlor. The stove had been lit, and the scent of burning wood filled the room. "Do you still have the personal effects?" Maigret asked. "The ones the man in room 4 left behind before the police took the rest." She hesitated, then nodded. From a small cupboard she retrieved a paper-wrapped bundle, socks, a bar of soap, an old safety razor, a comb. Maigret unfolded the items one by one on the table. In the toe of one sock was a crumpled ticket stub for a theatre dated 3 days before the man's death. No seat number. Just Théâtre de l'Est, Rue Pelleport. A local venue, small, rarely mentioned in the press. "Thank you," Maigret said. "Let me know if anyone else comes asking." She gave him a curious look. "Do you think he was someone important?" "I think he was someone trying not to be." The Théâtre de l'Est sat in a modest building near the corner of Rue Pelleport, nestled between a pharmacy and a shuttered boulangerie. Its posters were faded, the ticket window closed. Maigret knocked on the side door until an elderly man opened it, wearing a cap and the expression of someone disturbed from a long routine. "Yes," Maigret showed his badge. "Do you keep records of attendees, bookings, perhaps notes of who came in on the 23rd of October? The man scratched his cheek. "We don't take names unless it's a group. But that night it was a special reading, not many came, about 20 maybe. A local troupe, poetry and monologues." "Do you remember anyone unusual?" the man thought. There was one fellow, sat alone at the back, didn't clap, left before it ended. Describe him. Older, quiet, thin, neatly dressed, but not flashy. He seemed not out of place exactly, just distant. Maigret nodded. That afternoon, back at Quai des Orfèvres, he laid the stub beside the napkin note and the photograph. None of it amounted to a charge. None of it even proved a crime had occurred. But together they made a kind of pattern, a shadow cast in the shape of a life. He rang Janvier, find out if any death notices, not formal obituaries, have appeared in the local papers this month. I'm looking for a name, Léon Morel, or something close. Janvier returned with a list after 2 hours. Among them, one caught Maigret's attention. Léon Morel, 81, retired carpenter. Deceased 18th October, former resident of Oran, survived by no known relatives. There it was again, Oran. The small notice had been printed in a free circular, one that catered mostly to the elderly. It included a time and place for the burial. 23rd October, Cimetière de Bagneux, a pauper's grave. Maigret's next stop was the municipal archives. There, under the records of interments, he found confirmation. Léon Morel died of natural causes, unclaimed body, burial paid for by the city. Back at the office, Maigret unfolded the photograph one more time. He stared not at the central figure, but at the man seated at the far right, older, squinting in the sun. He hadn't noticed it before, but now the resemblance was plain. The cheekbones, the hands, the slope of the shoulders. Father and son. Maigret sat back, drawing slowly on his pipe, letting the smoke fill the room. What if the man calling himself Morel, the man from the café, had come not for himself, but for someone else? Not to hide, not to confess, but to bury a life no one else remembered. It would explain the return, the quiet visits to the same boarding house, the use of the name, the borrowed identity, once a joke, now a shroud. That night, he returned to Le Petit Baigneur. The air outside was brittle with cold, and frost clung to the window panes of the café. Inside, the same dim yellow light glowed, the same couple huddled at the middle table, but tonight, the back chair was occupied again. The man didn't look up when Maigret entered. He sat with his hands folded around a small glass, staring at the table. As Maigret approached, the man spoke without raising his eyes. "I wondered if you'd come." Maigret sat across from him. "You've left quite a trail." "Not much of one," the man said. "Only what I could afford." There was a silence between them, thick but not hostile. "Was Léon Morel your father?" A nod. Maigret studied the man's face, the guarded eyes, the tired mouth. "I didn't come back for me," he said. "I came because I saw his name in one of those little death notices. I don't know how he ended up here. We hadn't spoken in 30 years. "Why use his name?" The man smiled faintly. "Because I had no right to mine anymore." He reached into his coat and removed a folded page. It was a birth certificate. Michel Lestrade, born 1905, Oran. He passed it across the table. Maigret glanced at it and returned it. "I'm not here to charge you," he said. "There's no crime left." The man looked at him, startled. "But you followed me." "Yes." "Then what do you want?" Maigret lit his pipe slowly, deliberately. "I want to understand." The man stared for a moment. Then he nodded, and for the first time since their first silent meeting, his shoulders lowered just slightly. The mask, so carefully worn, had begun to shift. The man who had once been Michel Lestrade stirred the glass in his hand, watching the swirl of liquor as if it held something he had misplaced. The café around them murmured with the low clatter of cutlery and murmured conversations. At another table someone coughed. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying with it the hush of oncoming snow. Maigret waited. He knew better than to push. Confession, when it came, did not need coaxing. It needed space. Lestrade exhaled softly, setting his glass down with quiet care. "I hadn't seen him since 1941, he said. "My father. I left Oran that summer. I told him I had work in Tunis. I lied. There was no job, only the need to disappear." Maigret nodded, the pipe in his hand unlit, forgotten. "I changed my name in Marseille," Lestrade went on. "Picked something forgettable, Lambert for a while. Then Morel, which made him furious when I used it back then. He said I had no right to it." "Why did you choose his name again?" "Now? Because he had died alone." Lestrade's voice thinned. "Because there would be no one at the burial, not even a priest." He paused, as though waiting to feel something, then continued. "I found the grave. I went to Bagneux the day after I saw the notice. It was a cold morning. No flowers, no marker yet. The gravedigger gave me 5 minutes. I said nothing, just stood there. Then I left." Maigret stirred gently in his chair. "And the boarding house?" "I stayed there before," Lestrade said. "Years ago, after the war, briefly. It was a place I remembered, that's all. I thought if I came under his name, if I signed as him, it would be as though someone had come to collect him, as if he wasn't entirely forgotten." Maigret looked down at the table, and the notes you left. Flicker of a smile, barely there. "I didn't expect them to be read, I just couldn't speak. Not then. But you kept coming. That was surprising." "You were watching?" "Of course." Lestrade leaned back slightly. "I always sat somewhere else, farther down the street, sometimes in that little bakery across the road. I saw you sit at the table. You never pushed. That's why I finally came back." Maigret gave a faint nod. "I wasn't looking for an arrest, I just wanted to know who he was." "Just a man," Lestrade said with a distant glance. "A carpenter from Oran. He used to whistle while he worked, smoked gitanes. Thought silence meant disapproval." "Did it?" "Not always." There was a stillness between them again, though it was no longer strained. Lestrade seemed lighter now, not redeemed, not relieved, but as though a corner of his burden had been acknowledged. "You didn't come to reclaim your name," Maigret said. "No. You didn't come to make amends." "No." Maigret studied him. "Then why now?" Lestrade turned toward the fogged window. A tram rattled past outside, its lights blurred by condensation. "I'm old," he said at last, "and I'm tired. There comes a moment when you want to be seen, truly seen, just once more. Not praised, not forgiven, just seen. That's all." He reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, another one, not the one Maigret had received. This one was smaller, creased more deeply. It showed the same group as before, but closer, faces turned to the sun. He passed it across the table. "She was called Elise," he said, "the woman you met. We were together long ago. I almost sent her a letter before I left Oran. I didn't. I thought it would be cruel. She deserved a better ending." "She came," Maigret said. Lestrade's eyebrows rose slightly. "She sat where you sat. Told me about the room you shared, about the spirit stove. She said you were happy." Lestrade's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, not quite regret. "She remembers more than I deserve." "You gave her the photograph?" He nodded. "I left it in her mailbox, didn't want to face her. Didn't want her to see what time had done. She saw anyway." Maigret let that hang. Lestrade didn't answer. They finished their drinks slowly. Around them the café began to thin. The patron moved behind the bar, counting coins in a soft rhythm. A waitress collected empty glasses. Lestrade stood first. "Will you open a file?" he asked, still not looking directly at Maigret. "There's no crime to record. I changed my name, gave false information." "There's no charge for trying to grieve," Maigret said. The man paused, absorbing that. "I'll be leaving Paris soon," he said quietly. "I don't belong here anymore." "Where will you go?" "Nowhere in particular. I've lived in small towns. I'll find another. Somewhere near a port, maybe." He buttoned his coat slowly, with thick fingers. Maigret stood as well. "There's nothing more I need from you." Lestrade nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped. "I'm grateful you waited." Maigret said nothing. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and the snow had begun to fall. Not heavy, not yet, but enough to soften the edges of the pavement and blur the lamplight. Maigret watched as Lestrade walked into it, his figure growing smaller with each step until he vanished at the far end of the street, swallowed by the quiet drift of white. Maigret did not follow. He sat back down at the now empty table and relit his pipe. The warmth settled in his chest, and he watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. There was no report to write, no arrest to be made, only a name to remember. And a man who had finally allowed himself to be seen, if only once, before fading back into the silence he had lived within for decades. Snow had continued through the night, and by morning Paris wore a soft coat of white that muffled the city's usual clamor. The roofs of cars and kiosks were blanketed. The iron grates around trees along Boulevard Richard-Lenoir were traced, in fine patterns. The chimneys smoked steadily, sending thin grey ribbons into the bright, cold air. From the third-floor window of Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret looked out over the Seine. It had not frozen, but it moved sluggishly beneath a pale sky. The flow reminded him of Lestrade's voice, slow, reluctant, burdened but steady. A man who had learned to move forward in silence. Janvier entered with a light knock, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Quiet morning," he said, setting a file on Maigret's desk. Maigret turned, but didn't sit yet. "I won't need that," he said. "It can go to the others." Janvier gave him a glance, half curious. "Nothing urgent?" Maigret shook his head. "Only something I'm letting finish." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Janvier knew his chief had moods like this, slow-burning contemplations that didn't fit neatly into a case file or a report, things that lingered in the corners of his thoughts, gathering meaning long after the facts had stopped arriving. After Janvier left, Maigret lit his pipe and opened his coat to reach into the inner pocket. From it, he drew the small paper sleeve, the one containing both photographs and the final napkin note. He spread them out carefully on his desk. The images stared back at him, young faces in the sun, eyes squinting, a moment frozen between wars and regrets. And then the note. "I remember what I did." But no details followed, no confession, no crime attached to it, only a gesture, perhaps toward memory, perhaps toward forgiveness, perhaps neither. Maigret had received many confessions over the years. Some were desperate, others proud. A few arrived too late. But this had been different. It wasn't the content that mattered. It was the fact that someone had chosen to leave it at all. He folded the photographs and the note together and slid them into a file without a label. He placed it into the second drawer of his cabinet, the one he rarely touched, where unsolved cases mingled with personal correspondences, and the odd reminder that not all truths were for public display. The day passed in stillness. Reports came in, a smashed bakery window in Montmartre, a domestic quarrel near Rue Oberkampf, but nothing that called to him. He reviewed a few summaries, signed one requisition form, and walked down to the canteen for coffee. The building remained hushed, as if the snowfall outside had seeped into its walls. In the late afternoon, as the sky began to dim, he put on his coat and stepped out. The snow was still falling, lightly now, like sifted flour. His breath came in warm clouds. He walked not toward home, nor toward any particular investigation, but toward the cemetery at Bagneux. It took nearly an hour to reach on foot, his steps slow, not from age, but from deliberation. The sidewalks were slushy in some places, untouched in others. The trams passed in silence, their wheels muffled by the snowfall. At the cemetery gates, a custodian with red hands and a muffler nodded at him without question. Maigret walked past rows of stones and iron fences, finding the section reserved for those without names, or with names no longer spoken by family. Here the markers were wooden, simple, a few still blank, awaiting engraving. He found the grave of Léon Morel. A light dusting of snow covered the small mound. There were no flowers, no footprints nearby. Maigret stood for a long time, hands in his coat, pipe unlit in his mouth. He imagined the carpenter from Oran, a man who had taught his son to build, perhaps, or perhaps not. A man who had whistled, and smoked and expected silence to mean something it didn't. A man who had died alone, but who, in the end, had not been entirely forgotten. Somewhere in the city, Michel Lestrade or Morel or Lambert, or whatever name he now carried, had chosen to leave again. Not because he was chaste, but because he had completed what he came to do. He had stood at this grave. He had waited in a café. He had passed a photograph through the hands of a woman who had once loved him, and through a detective who asked no questions, only waited. Maigret stepped forward and bent down. He brushed the snow from the modest wooden plaque. It bore only the name, burned into the surface with uneven heat, Léon Morel. Below it a small space had been left for dates. Only one was written, 1942-1973. The first was likely wrong. He straightened up again. There was nothing more to say. The wind carried only silence. He turned and walked slowly back toward the gate, his boots sinking with each step. At the exit, he passed a florist's stand almost hidden behind the stone wall. A young girl stood there, her cheeks red from the cold. He paused and bought a single carnation. He returned to the grave and placed it at the head, letting the petals rest gently against the snow. He did not speak. He did not cross himself. He simply stood a moment longer, then left. As he returned to the city, the snowfall began to lighten. The streets grew clearer. People emerged again from doorways, brushing off coats, stepping carefully. Along the thawing pavement, Paris, as always, continued. That evening, back at home, Madame Maigret set out the veal stew she had prepared that morning. They ate without much talk. She noticed, as she often did, that his thoughts were elsewhere but did not ask. She only poured him a second glass of wine and refolded the napkin at his elbow. "Cold today," she said. "Yes," Maigret murmured, but not unkind. Later, as the fire burned low and the shutters rattled gently in the wind, he sat in his chair, the photograph still in his coat pocket, the weight of it not heavy, but present. Outside, the last of the snow drifted silently over the rooftops, covering the streets where footsteps had already faded. And somewhere, a man who had once been someone else walked into a new town, carrying only memory and the silence of a life briefly acknowledged. The following days drifted by in a kind of stillness. A slow post-snow hush settled over Paris, as though the city itself were catching its breath. The bouquinistes along the Seine reopened, brushing moisture from their shelves. On the corners, chestnut vendors lit coals again, and the bells from the tramcars rang with greater clarity, as if freed from the weight of white, Maigret returned to the rhythm of the office without fanfare. He answered reports, sat in on a review of an extortion case near Porte de Choisy, listened with half interest as Janvier explained a brawl between two competing brasserie owners in Montparnasse. But even as he nodded, even as he stamped the required forms, his thoughts drifted unmoored to the man who had not truly been named Morel. It was not the case. Not really. There was no victim, no crime. There had been no charge, no prosecution, no moment where everything had coalesced into a final, satisfying explanation. And yet, something had concluded. Still, a detail bothered him. Not large, not urgent, but something left suspended. On Thursday morning, before the snow had fully melted from the courtyard ledges, he unlocked his second drawer and removed the unlabeled file. He opened it slowly, as if expecting something new to have formed. Inside, the napkin note was still there. So were the photographs and the folded letter left for Elise. He read through them again with the same deliberate attention he would give to a signed confession. But nothing had changed. What remained was not fact, but impression. A man had returned. To Paris not for justice or atonement, but to be near something. His father, a past love, a name once used and later avoided. Maigret had not pursued him. He had simply waited. But one detail had never been resolved, the question of the first signature, not the final one left in the café, but the earliest, the one dated back in January, in the old boarding house ledger. It was the first time El Morel appeared, long before the father had died, before the obituary notice, before the return. So who had written it? Maigret stood and walked to the window. Outside, two pigeons pecked along the wet edge of the rooftop. A boy passed below carrying a violin case, his cap pulled low. He returned to his desk and rang the Rue Abel boarding house once more. The same voice answered. "Madame Fournier, it's Maigret again. I need to look at your ledgers one last time." There was no surprise in her tone, only resignation. "Of course, they're where you left them." When he arrived, the street outside the house was slick with thawing slush. A salt truck rattled past, scattering grit along the curb. He climbed the familiar stairway to the second floor, then followed her into the back room where the ledgers waited. This time he opened the first book directly in January. The entry read, El Morel, Room 314 January, paid in advance. He looked at the signature again. It was not the same as the others. At first glance, the hand seemed familiar, but under scrutiny it differed slightly. More confident, more fluid. The earlier entries signed as Morel were careful, almost rehearsed. This one wasn't. It had a natural rhythm. He turned to Madame Fournier. "Do you remember anything else?" "About this first Morel?" She narrowed her eyes, thinking. He was younger, maybe in his 40s, not talkative but polite. Came with a small suitcase, stayed only 2 nights, said he was going south. "Did anyone ever come asking for him?" "No one." Maigret stared at the page again. "And you're certain the Morel from October, the one who died, was not the same man?" "I'm certain. Different build, different voices, different eyes." Maigret closed the ledger slowly. There had been 2 Morels, or at least 2, men using the name, one in January, one in October, one whose identity remained entirely unknown, and one who came back not to claim, but to remember. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret made a new note for the file. First Morel, January 14th, room 3. No follow-up. Signature inconsistent. Likely unrelated. He hesitated before adding the next line. Possibility. The man from October was following the trace of another. He circled it once. That evening, he visited the cemetery again. Not to visit the grave, not directly. He walked the paths more slowly this time, reading other names, noting the dates. The air had warmed slightly. The snow on the headstones had shrunk to thin white traces like breath marks on glass. Near the back of the grounds, he saw a figure, standing still, not at the grave of Léon Morel, but nearby beside a different stone. The man was tall, coat pulled tight, a hat low over his brow. He stood in the slanted light as if unaware of time. Maigret approached quietly, not to confront, but to witness. As he neared, the figure turned. It was not Lestrade. A stranger. Younger than he expected. Eyes shadowed, hands gloved. He did not look startled nor guilty, just aware. "Can I help you?" Maigret asked. The man studied him. "No," he said. "I'm just visiting. For someone named Morel?" A pause, then, "No, someone else." Maigret nodded. They stood in silence for a moment. Then the man turned and walked away, leaving faint footprints that vanished within 20 paces. Maigret watched him go. It was possible, of course, that it meant nothing, but he had learned long ago that in lives like Lestrade's, and those orbiting them, nothing was entirely without shadow. People left traces they did not intend. They returned to places that had once been meaningless, but now held weight simply by being remembered. Back home, Madame Maigret was trimming dead leaves from a potted fern near the window. "You look thoughtful," she said. "I suppose I am." "Another case?" "No, just an ending that refuses to be complete." She looked up at him with her quiet smile. "They rarely are, Jules." He said nothing, but watched the leaves fall one by one into the sink. Later that night, he returned to his chair. He unfolded the photograph again, faces from Oran, their lives now scattered across the years. He turned it over, but there was still only the word Oran. He considered adding something, a date, a name, a note. But instead he returned it to the envelope and placed it back in the drawer. Not every ending needs a final sentence. Some are meant only to linger, quiet and unfinished, like footsteps fading down a snow-covered street. It was a week before Maigret returned to the file again. Other cases had arrived in the meantime. A runaway girl found near the canal, a burglary in the 16th arrondissement that turned out to be an argument between lovers, and a long interview with a retiring magistrate who spoke more about his pigeons than his rulings. The rhythms of the office reasserted themselves, steady, bureaucratic, familiar. Still, every time Maigret opened the second drawer, he felt the quiet pull of the unlabeled folder resting there, undisturbed but not forgotten. It was a damp Tuesday when he finally opened it again. The photographs, the note, the old birth certificate folded into quarters, all lay as he had left them, unchanged. The handwriting stared up at him with its measured quietness. Nothing had moved. Yet Maigret felt the weight of time pressing differently now. He sat back and lit his pipe. A soft knock came at the door. Janvier entered with a slip of paper. "Post just came in," he said. "There's something addressed to you. No return. Address, but hand-delivered." He handed it over and waited, uncertain whether to linger or leave. Maigret dismissed him with a nod. The envelope was plain, unsealed. Inside, a single sheet. I saw her again. I didn't speak. I stood across the street. She looked older. So did I. That was enough. I'm going. No signature. But the slant of the writing was unmistakable. He held the page in one hand, motionless. There was nothing more to be said, and yet the note said everything. He could see it in his mind. The narrow street, the early dusk, the woman in the yawl, scarf perhaps pausing with a bag of groceries, looking both ways, unaware that a man had watched her for the final time. That no word had passed between them was fitting. They had lived more in silence than in speech, and now, as quietly as he had arrived, Lestrade had left. There would be no more napkin notes, no more letters in blue envelopes, no final visit to the back table. Maigret reached once again into the drawer, placing the new note on top of the others. He didn't staple it, he didn't mark the page. Instead, he leaned back and let his gaze drift toward the window. Outside, the last of winter's grey was giving way to a fragile sunlight. The rooftops steamed faintly, and a delivery cart rattled down the street below, its wheels clacking over the cobblestones. He thought of Lestrade not as a criminal nor even as a fugitive, but as a man who had wandered through the gaps of official memory. A name on a ledger, a face in a photograph, a pair of eyes glimpsed too late across a café mirror. A man who had fled the past but could never quite outrun it, and who in the end had chosen to stop running not with a declaration but with a glance. Perhaps he had boarded a train. Perhaps he had walked out of Paris on foot. Maigret would never know, and he didn't need to. What mattered was not where he had gone, but that he had chosen to go. On his terms. Later that evening, Maigret returned home early. Madame Maigret had set the table with her usual care, slices of ham, a small salad, warm bread wrapped in a cloth napkin. They ate in quiet companionship, broken now and then by her commentary on a neighbour's new curtains or a friend's unfortunate haircut. After dinner, he poured himself a calvados and sat by the window. The streets below were nearly dark now. The lamplight pooled softly on the wet pavement, and across the way a tailor was locking up his shop. He reached into his coat and removed the second photograph, the one Lestrade had handed him that final night, the one showing Elise more clearly. She was laughing at it, not dramatically, but in that brief, surprised way people laugh when someone says something kind, without meaning to. She had not smiled in the café, but this smile, captured in sun and youth, felt eternal. Maigret propped the photo on the windowsill for a moment and watched it reflect in the glass. Two lives paused together. A moment neither had expected to last, and yet had lasted in a way neither could have anticipated. It reminded him of something Madame Maigret had once said years ago on a walk by the canal. Some people we only pass once, but they walk beside us for a long time. He thought of the man called Morel, the false names, the empty rooms, the letter with no address, and the final visit to the grave of a father who never knew he had been claimed. He did not cry, but the pipe in his hand went out. The next day, Maigret filed the folder not among the open cases nor the closed ones, but in the thin space at the back of the drawer. He placed no identifying label on it, no date, no initials, just a quiet file among the others, holding a handful of papers, and a sliver of a life that had crossed his own for a few days, then moved on. Janvier asked nothing, nor did Madame Maigret. Only the drawer, when opened in the years to come, might recall that for a brief moment in winter, a man who did not want to be known had been seen. The drawer never quite closed all the way after that. A fraction of space always remained, enough to remind Maigret that some endings had no punctuation, only a pause, and as the seasons turned and the river continued its slow passage beneath the bridges, the inspector, pipe in hand, would sometimes glance at that drawer without opening it, not to reread the story, but to remember that it had existed.